In a tense courtroom, the clock's ticking echoed rhythmically. The entire room was so silent, you could hear a pin drop. Every eye was on Ethan Parker, a 16-year-old teenager standing in the middle of the room, his hands trembling, but his voice steady. He raised his head, eyes fixed on the man sitting at the defense table. His father. "I have something to say," Ethan began, his voice not wavering like his hands. He didn't look away from Brian Parker, the man everyone admired. Ethan took a deep breath, his next words like a bombshell in the courtroom. "Dad, you know what you did. You lied to everyone, including me, and I can't keep your secret anymore." Gasps echoed through the room. Brian Parker, the successful, well-respected businessman, suddenly turned pale. Chairs creaked as people shifted in their seats, their eyes locked on the unfolding drama. The judge raised his hand, demanding silence, but the whispers in the courtroom only grew louder. Ethan stepped forward, his face a mix of fear and determination, holding a piece of paper tightly in his hands. "Dad, I can't stay silent while everyone believes you're a hero. They don't know the truth. I can't keep this secret any longer. I have proof, and I'm going to tell them everything." All eyes were now on Ethan, standing there, his hands shaking but his heart unyielding. He couldn't imagine what would happen after he left this courtroom, but he knew this was something he had to do. He had to expose the truth about the man he had always called Dad. "Sit down, Ethan," Brian hissed, forcing a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. His face darkened with a mix of anger and desperation, his fists clenched. "Everything you're saying is wrong. You don't understand what's going on. Don't make this mistake." "No, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice rising. "I can't stay quiet while everyone's being lied to. You're the only one who knows the truth, and I can't stay silent anymore." He stared straight into his father's eyes, every word a wound. Brian stood up, towering over Ethan. "You don't understand. Drop this, Ethan, now," he said, his voice turning cold and threatening. Ethan didn't back down. He stepped closer, still holding that piece of paper. "You can't keep lying to everyone. I've seen everything. The late-night phone calls, the secret meetings, and those papers in that briefcase hidden in the attic. You're a liar." Each word Ethan spoke felt like a knife to Brian's heart, but Brian refused to acknowledge it. He had built his life on lies, on a perfect image that he could never let crumble. But now, everything he had built was at risk, all because of the words of a son he thought he could control. "You don't know what you're talking about," Brian said, his voice a low growl, trying to push Ethan away. "You have no idea what I had to do." But Ethan could no longer stay silent. He looked at the man he had once admired, the one he thought he could trust, and realized that he had been lied to all along. "I don't need your protection anymore," Ethan bit his lip, standing tall. "I'm going to find the truth, whether you want me to or not." At that moment, a man in a dark suit rushed into the courtroom, holding a piece of paper and handing it to the judge. The judge's eyes widened as he read the note, then looked back at Ethan with a sharper, more focused gaze. "Mr. Parker," the judge spoke, his voice calm yet commanding, "can you tell us exactly what you have in that paper?" Ethan swallowed, his hands still trembling as he unfolded the paper. He glanced from the judge to the sea of faces in the room. He took a deep breath, ready to speak, when suddenly a loud crash came from the back of the courtroom. All heads turned as a woman stood up, shouting, "Stop! You don't know what you're doing, Ethan!" The courtroom erupted into chaos. Ethan froze, confusion setting in. Who was this woman? And why was she trying to stop him from revealing the truth? The situation was becoming more complicated than Ethan had ever imagined. A week before the chaotic day in court, Ethan had been just another high school junior in Oakwood, a small, quiet town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Ethan lived with his father, Brian, in a large house on Maple Street, a picturesque place that seemed perfect from the outside. Brian was a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, often donating to local charities and sponsoring community events. People in the town admired him, and many called him the Golden Boy, the man who could do no wrong. But Ethan knew a different side of his father. He had always admired his dad, trusted him completely, but lately, something had felt off. Ethan had seen the late-night phone calls, the hushed conversations behind closed doors, and the way Brian snapped at him whenever he asked too many questions. It wasn't just the whispers in the town that had begun to make Ethan uneasy. It was his father's smile, which sometimes seemed more like a mask than a reflection of the man he thought he knew. There were moments when Brian's warm exterior would crack, revealing something much darker beneath the surface. Ethan's suspicions had been growing for months, and he knew something wasn't right. One evening, as the sun began to set, Ethan went up to the attic to grab an old family photo album he'd misplaced. It was then that he noticed something odd. In the far corner of the attic, behind stacks of boxes and dusty old furniture, he found a black leather briefcase. It wasn't like the other old files and keepsakes stashed away up there. This briefcase was well kept, and the lock on it looked new. His curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to open it. Inside, he found a pile of documents, some with unfamiliar names, others with financial figures that didn't make sense. There were also letters. They were short, cryptic notes, almost like coded messages. And the more Ethan read, the clearer it became. His father wasn't just hiding something, he was orchestrating it. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he looked over the papers. The documents spoke of shell companies, offshore accounts, and financial schemes that Ethan couldn't fully understand. But one thing was certain. His father was involved in something illegal. Ethan didn't know what to make of it all. How could the man he had trusted his whole life, his hero, the man who had always been there for him, be capable of such deception? The weight of the discovery was overwhelming. He knew he couldn't keep it to himself, but he also didn't want to believe it was true. He spent the next few nights poring over the documents, trying to make sense of the mess in front of him. Every new detail he uncovered made him more and more certain of his worst fears. His father was hiding something much darker than anyone could imagine. It wasn't until the next day that Ethan finally decided he couldn't carry this burden alone. He needed someone he could trust. He thought of Olivia Carter, his best friend, who had always been there for him through thick and thin. Olivia was the one person who knew him better than anyone else, and he knew she wouldn't judge him. The next morning, after math class, Ethan found Olivia waiting for him by the lockers. She immediately noticed something was off. "Hey, you've been acting weird all week," Olivia said, her voice laced with concern. "What's going on? You can tell me, you know." Ethan hesitated. He didn't know how to begin. Could he really tell her what he'd found? It felt like a massive burden, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to share it. "It's nothing," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Come on, Ethan. I know you better than that," Olivia insisted. "Something's wrong, I can tell." She crossed her arms, waiting for him to open up. With a deep sigh, Ethan led Olivia to an empty hallway. He glanced around, making sure no one was nearby. "You can't tell anyone, okay?" he whispered, his voice shaking slightly. Olivia nodded, her expression serious. "I swear, whatever it is, I won't tell anyone." Ethan paused, his throat dry. He felt the weight of the secret pressing down on him, but he knew he couldn't keep it inside any longer. "I think my dad is hiding something. Something big. Something illegal." Olivia's eyes widened. What do you mean? Are you sure? Ethan explained everything he had found. The briefcase, the documents, the strange letters. Olivia listened intently, her face growing more and more concerned as Ethan spoke. The more he revealed, the more terrified he became. This is bad, Ethan, Olivia said, her voice barely above a whisper. If your dad's involved in something illegal, you could be in danger. Have you told anyone else? No, Ethan admitted, his voice tight. And I'm not sure I should. What if I'm wrong? What if I ruin his reputation for nothing? But what if you're right? Olivia countered. You can't just ignore this. You have to do something. Ethan knew she was right. The thought of confronting his father terrified him, but the idea of doing nothing felt worse. I don't know what to do, he confessed. I feel like I'm going crazy. Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder. I'll help you, okay? We'll figure this out together. But you can't keep ignoring it. You have to confront it, head on. Ethan nodded. But as much as he wanted to believe Olivia, part of him still felt like he was stuck in a nightmare. How could he ever face his father after what he'd uncovered? The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and dread. Ethan couldn't focus on anything else. Every time he thought about the documents, his stomach twisted. The more he looked at the papers, the more it seemed like his father was involved in something far more sinister than just financial crimes. One night, unable to sleep, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't keep living in the dark. He had to confront Brian. He had to know the truth. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the briefcase his father had hidden so carefully in the attic. The papers inside weighed heavily on his mind, the numbers and names swirling around in his thoughts. He had barely slept, his body feeling like it was running on adrenaline. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw his father's face, smiling, reassuring, hiding something so dark beneath the surface. Ethan couldn't ignore it anymore. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine, that his dad was just a great man living the American dream. The truth was out there, and Ethan had to face it head on. The next morning, after a sleepless night of replaying the confrontation in his head, Ethan made his decision. He had to confront Brian. He needed answers, and he knew he couldn't keep living in the shadows of his father's lies. "Dad, can we talk?" Ethan asked when he found Brian in his study that afternoon, his voice tight with nervousness. Brian didn't look up from the pile of papers on his desk. He always seemed so busy, so important, like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. But Ethan knew it wasn't just business that occupied his mind. It was something far more dangerous. "Sure, sport," Brian replied, his voice warm, his smile practiced. "What's on your mind?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his palms damp with sweat. "I found something," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the attic. A briefcase. Inside were documents. Documents that don't make sense. Dad, I need to know what they mean." The smile on Brian's face faltered for a split second before he quickly masked it with a more neutral expression. He set his glass of whiskey down slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Ethan. "What exactly did you find?" Brian asked, his voice suddenly colder, more measured. Ethan's mind raced. He had never seen his father like this before. It was as though the man he had known all his life was suddenly slipping away, revealing something darker underneath. "I found papers, financial papers, letters, things I don't understand, names I don't recognize, transactions I can't make sense of," Ethan continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "What is all this, Dad? What's going on?" Brian stood up abruptly, the chair scraping across the floor as he pushed it back. He towered over Ethan now, his eyes full of a cold fury that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You had no right to go through my things," Brian said, his voice low and threatening. "You should have never seen that." "I had every right," Ethan shot back, his fear now replaced by a growing anger. "You've been lying to me my whole life, Dad. I deserve to know the truth." Brian's face turned pale, his eyes darkening. He took a step toward Ethan, his fists clenched. "You don't understand what you're talking about," Brian growled. "You think you can just come in here and dig through my life? You think you can expose me like this? You're just a kid, Ethan. You don't know the first thing about the real world." Ethan's heart raced as the tension in the room escalated. He wanted to back down, to turn away, but something inside him kept him standing there. He wasn't going to let his father intimidate him. Not anymore. "No, Dad," Ethan said firmly, his voice unwavering. "I'm not going to drop this. I'm going to find out what you've been hiding, whether you like it or not." Brian's jaw tightened, and for a moment Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, but it was gone before he could process it. Brian took another step toward Ethan, his body rigid with anger. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," Brian said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've done things for this family, things you can't even begin to understand. And if you keep pushing, you're going to destroy everything." Ethan's anger flared. "I'm not destroying anything. You are," he spat, his words sharp and cutting. "You're the one who's been lying to everyone, and I won't let you get away with it." Brian's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you can handle the truth? You think you're ready for what's coming? You're just a kid, Ethan. You don't know what it means to protect your family, to do what's necessary." The air between them was thick with tension, and Ethan could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he didn't back down. He wouldn't. This wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about justice. It was about truth. "I'm not backing down, Dad," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm going to find the truth, even if I have to do it without you." Brian took a step back, his face dark with rage. "You don't understand what you're messing with," he muttered. "Drop it now, Ethan. Walk away, for your own good." But Ethan didn't walk away. He stood his ground, feeling the weight of everything he had just uncovered crash down on him. "I can't. Not anymore." The room fell silent for a long moment, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Brian spoke again, his voice strained, his words slow and deliberate. "You don't know what you're asking for," Brian said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "If you keep digging, you're going to ruin everything. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built. Do you really want to destroy this family, Ethan?" Ethan's chest tightened, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. But the doubt quickly faded. He had to do this. For his mother, for himself, for everything he had ever believed in. "I'm not destroying the family, Dad," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. "I'm just trying to save it. And I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." The silence that followed was deafening. Brian didn't say anything. He just stared at Ethan, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger, frustration, and something else, something that looked like fear. Ethan turned and walked out of the room, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. The days following Ethan's confrontation with his father were a blur of tension and uncertainty. He spent every waking moment poring over the documents he had found, trying to make sense of the twisted financial dealings and cryptic messages. The weight of the secret was becoming unbearable, but Ethan knew he couldn't back down. Not now. At school, It was impossible to focus. His mind kept returning to the moment he had stood in front of his father and exposed everything. The way Brian's face had twisted with anger, the icy tone in his voice as he tried to silence Ethan. It haunted him. What would happen next? How far was Brian willing to go to protect his secrets? Ethan didn't know, but he was determined to find out. Olivia had been the only bright spot in the midst of the storm. She was the one person he could turn to, the one person who seemed to understand. After their conversation, Olivia had promised to help Ethan. She knew how much this was tearing him apart, but she also knew that Ethan was doing the right thing. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. It was after school one day that Olivia found Ethan sitting alone at their usual spot in the cafeteria, his head buried in his hands. He was staring down at the documents he had brought with him, trying to make sense of the maze of names and numbers. But no matter how hard he tried, it felt like the puzzle was incomplete. The more he uncovered, the more questions arose. "Hey," Olivia said softly, sitting down across from him. "You've been quiet all day. What's going on?" Ethan lifted his head, his eyes tired, a faraway look in them. "I can't figure it out, Olivia. The more I look at these, the more confused I get. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, but I'm missing something big. And the longer I wait, the more dangerous it gets." Olivia studied him for a moment, her gaze soft but firm. "You don't have to do this alone, you know. I'm here. We're in this together, remember?" Ethan nodded slowly, his heart heavy. He had always been the one to keep things to himself, to bottle up his emotions, but Olivia's presence was a constant reminder that he didn't have to carry the burden alone. He needed her now more than ever. "I know," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "But I feel like I'm in way over my head. This isn't just about me anymore. This is bigger than I imagined." "Then we'll figure it out together," Olivia said, determination in her voice. "You've already taken the hardest step. You confronted your dad. Now, we just need to get to the bottom of this." Ethan looked at her, grateful for her support. He had always known Olivia was a good friend, but in that moment, he realized just how much she meant to him. She had stood by him through thick and thin, and now she was willing to risk everything to help him uncover the truth. "I don't know where to start," Ethan confessed. "The more I dig into this, the more I realize just how much is hidden. There are connections to offshore accounts, fraudulent charities, and people I've never even heard of. It's like trying to find a needle in a haystack." Olivia leaned over, her eyes scanning the documents in front of Ethan. "Let's break it down," she said. "One step at a time. Start with the names. Who are these people? Maybe we can find something that connects them." Ethan nodded, relieved to have a clear direction. They spent the next hour combing through the documents, cross-referencing names and numbers. At first, it felt like they were getting nowhere. But then, Olivia's sharp eye caught something. "Wait a minute," she said, pointing to a name that had appeared multiple times. "This guy, Victor Kane. I've heard that name before. He's involved in some shady business dealings, but I couldn't remember the details. He's been linked to a few high-profile financial crimes." Ethan's pulse quickened. "Victor Kane? I've seen that name too, but I didn't know he was connected to all this. What do you mean by shady business dealings?" Olivia shrugged. "I've read some articles about him. He's got connections to several people in the business world, and he's known for handling, let's just say, dirty work. He's the kind of guy who does things quietly, under the radar. If your dad is involved with him, this just got a whole lot more serious." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. If his father was connected to someone like Victor Kane, then the stakes had just been raised to an entirely new level. Victor Kane was no ordinary criminal. He was a fixer, a man who operated in the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes. And if he was involved in this, there was no telling how deep the corruption went. "We need to find out more about him," Ethan said, his voice determined. "We have to figure out how my dad is connected to him, and if he's involved in my mom's death." Olivia's face softened with concern. "Ethan, we'll figure it out. But we need to be careful. Victor Kane doesn't mess around. He's dangerous." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of Olivia's words. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was so close to the truth. "I don't care. I need to know what happened to my mom. And I need to know what my dad has been hiding all these years." They spent the rest of the afternoon researching Victor Kane, digging into old news articles and court records. The more they uncovered, the more it seemed like Kane was connected to everything: fraudulent businesses, money laundering, and even threats to people who had tried to expose him. Ethan's gut told him that Kane was the key to unlocking the mystery of his father's criminal empire. As the sun began to set, Ethan and Olivia sat in the quiet of the school library, their heads buried in their laptops. They were both exhausted, but neither of them was willing to stop. They were so close, they could almost taste the truth. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. "We're getting closer, Olivia. I can feel it." She smiled at him, her eyes bright with determination. "We'll keep digging until we find everything. You're not alone in this, Ethan." Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. With Olivia by his side, he knew he could face whatever came next. But as he glanced down at the documents, one thought lingered in his mind. What would happen when the truth finally came to light? The following days were a blur of intense research and growing fear. Ethan and Olivia had dug deep into Victor Kane's past, unraveling connections that painted a grim picture of his involvement with his father. The more they uncovered, the more Ethan began to feel like a small cog in a much larger, more dangerous machine. His father, Brian Parker, wasn't just a businessman who had made some mistakes. He was a key player in a network of crime, fraud, and corruption that stretched far beyond Oakwood. Every time Ethan thought he had uncovered the truth, another layer of the mystery revealed itself. Victor Kane wasn't just involved in shady deals. He was involved in every major criminal activity Brian had ever been a part of. And the more Ethan learned, the more it became clear. His father had been hiding something far more deadly than money laundering or offshore accounts. Brian had been hiding the truth about Ethan's mother's death. One evening, after school, Ethan and Olivia sat in a quiet corner of the local coffee shop, poring over the final pieces of the puzzle. They had managed to track down a few old business partners of Victor Kane and Brian Parker, and the results were horrifying. There were rumors of threats, cover-ups, and things that no one should have to deal with. But Ethan was determined to find out the whole truth. "Olivia," Ethan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know what to believe anymore. The more I dig into this, the more I realize my whole life has been a lie. Everything I thought I knew about my dad, about my family, it's all falling apart." Olivia placed a hand on his arm, offering comfort, despite the gravity of the situation. "I know, Ethan. This is hard, but the truth is worth it. You've already taken the hardest step by confronting your dad. Now we just have to make sure the whole story comes out." Ethan nodded, but the weight of the situation was becoming unbearable. His father was a man who had lied, manipulated, and used everyone around him to build his empire. And now, Ethan was standing at the center of it all, with the power to expose the lies, or to become a victim of them. Just as Ethan was about to speak again, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it and saw a message from an unknown number. "Meet me." You're in danger. Don't tell anyone. L. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the message, unsure what to make of it. Who was L? And why were they telling him he was in danger? What is it? Olivia asked, noticing his change in expression. It's from someone named L, Ethan replied, his voice tense. They want me to meet them. They say I'm in danger. Olivia's face paled. This doesn't sound good. You can't just meet someone you don't know, Ethan. It could be a trap. Ethan thought for a moment. I don't have a choice. Whoever this is, they know something. They might know the truth about my mom's death. And I need to know what they know. Olivia hesitated, but then nodded. I'll go with you. I'm not letting you face this alone. Ethan agreed, though part of him was filled with unease. Meeting someone he didn't know, especially after everything that had happened, felt like stepping into the unknown. But if it meant uncovering the truth, he was willing to take the risk. They agreed to meet in a secluded park near the edge of town. It was quiet, far from the prying eyes of Oakwood's tight-knit community. As Ethan and Olivia arrived, they scanned the area, looking for any signs of danger. But the park was eerily silent, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. They waited for what felt like an eternity before a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a woman, her face partially obscured by a hood. She walked toward them with a determined pace, her footsteps steady despite the tension in the air. "Ethan Parker?" the woman asked, her voice calm but filled with urgency. Ethan nodded, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Who are you? What do you know about my father?" The woman hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "My name is Lila. I knew your mother." Ethan's heart raced as the name hit him like a wave. "Lila," he repeated, confused. "You knew my mom? How?" Lila's face softened with sorrow, and she stepped closer. "I was her sister," she said quietly. Ethan froze. Her sister? The words barely registered in his mind. "But my mom, she didn't have a sister. She died when I was 3. Lila's eyes filled with tears. "That's what your father told you, isn't it? But it's a lie, Ethan. I've been kept away from you for years. Your mother didn't die in an accident. She was murdered." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "What? That's not possible. My dad told me." "Your father lied to you," Lila interrupted gently. "He didn't want you to know the truth. He didn't want you to know that your mother found out about his illegal activities. She was going to expose him, Ethan. But before she could, they killed her." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. Murder? His mother had been murdered because she knew the truth about his father? It didn't make sense. Brian Parker, the man who had been his hero, the man who had raised him, was capable of something so monstrous? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why keep it a secret all these years?" Lila looked down, her expression filled with guilt. "I tried, Ethan. I tried to warn her. But your father, he has power, connections. He made sure I stayed away from you. He said it was for your safety. But I see now that I was wrong. I should have fought harder. I should have told you the truth sooner." Ethan's mind was spinning. The woman who had just revealed herself as his aunt had kept the truth from him all these years. His mother had known the dangers of Brian Parker's empire, but she had been silenced before she could expose it. And now, here he was, standing in the middle of it all, holding the key to unlocking the past. Lila stepped closer, her voice soft, but filled with resolve. "Ethan, you're the only one who can stop him. You're the only one who can expose everything." Ethan felt a surge of emotion as the weight of the situation crashed down on him. He had thought he was fighting to uncover the truth about his father's finances, about his illegal activities. But now he realized that this was bigger than that. This was about his mother. This was about justice. "How do we stop him?" Ethan asked, his voice filled with determination. Lila glanced around, making sure no one was watching. "We need to get the evidence. Everything he's been hiding. Every document. Every transaction. If we can prove he was involved in your mother's death, then we can take him down." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. "I'm ready. Let's do this." But even as he spoke the words, a part of him wondered what the cost of the truth would be. Would he lose everything? His father? His home? His future? Was he willing to sacrifice it all for justice? The weight of the revelation about his mother's death was suffocating. Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him had vanished, leaving him suspended in a void. The woman standing before him, Lila, his aunt, had just shattered everything he thought he knew about his family. His mother hadn't died in an accident, as Brian had always claimed. She had been murdered, silenced, because she knew the truth about his father. And now, Ethan had to find a way to expose it all. Lila's words echoed in his mind. "You're the only one who can stop him. You're the only one who can expose everything." The responsibility weighed heavily on him, but at the same time, he felt a sense of purpose. This was bigger than his fear, bigger than the anger he felt toward Brian. His mother had been taken from him because she wanted to stop the corruption his father had built his life on. Now, Ethan would finish what she had started. Lila looked around nervously, as though the shadows themselves might hold secrets that could put them in danger. "We need to move quickly, Ethan," she urged. "We have to get the evidence before your father or Victor Kane can destroy it. Once it's gone, there's no turning back." Ethan nodded, his eyes hardening with determination. "Where do we start?" Lila's face grew serious. "We need to get into your father's office. That's where he keeps everything. The documents, the records, everything that ties him to Victor Kane. If we can find that, we can bring him down." "His office?" Ethan asked, surprised. "I don't know how we're going to get in there. Dad keeps it locked up tight." Lila glanced around once more, making sure no one was eavesdropping. "I have a plan. We're going to have to move fast. It won't be easy, but we don't have a choice." Ethan felt a surge of anxiety rush through him, but he pushed it aside. This was it. If he didn't act now, everything he had uncovered so far would be in vain. He had to do this for his mother. He had to do it for himself. That night, after dinner, Ethan pretended everything was normal. He went through the motions, making small talk with Brian and trying to act as though nothing was wrong. It was harder than he expected. Every time Brian looked at him, Ethan felt the weight of his lies pressing down on him, threatening to crush him, but he couldn't give up. Not now. After Brian went to bed, Ethan slipped into the hallway, heart pounding. Lila had left a message earlier in the day, telling him to meet her in the garage after midnight. That was when they would make their move. It was risky, but it was their only option. Ethan crept through the dark house, moving as silently as he could. His father's study was on the second floor, at the far end of the hallway. As he approached the door, he felt a knot of dread form in his stomach. This was it, the moment of truth. He had no idea what he would find inside, but he knew it wouldn't be good. He reached the study and found the door locked, just as he had expected. He pulled out the small set of keys Lila had given him earlier in the evening. They had taken a huge risk in getting them, but it was the only way to gain access to the study without alerting Brian. Ethan's hand shook as he slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and he stepped inside. The room was exactly as he remembered it. Leather chairs, a large wooden desk piled high with papers, and the faint smell of expensive cologne in the air. But now, it felt like a prison, a place where secrets were buried, a place where his father had hidden the truth. Ethan scanned the room, looking for anything that could lead him to the documents Lila had mentioned. He moved quickly, pulling drawers open, rifling through stacks of papers, searching for anything that might connect Brian to Victor Kane or to his mother's death. The hours seemed to stretch on, each minute feeling like an eternity. Ethan's eyes burned from lack of sleep, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every moment spent searching brought him closer to the answers he had been desperate to find. His fingers were trembling as he pulled open the final drawer of the desk, the one at the very bottom. Inside, he found a thick manila folder, labeled Confidential. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He opened the folder carefully, feeling as though he were holding a piece of his family's dark history in his hands. Inside, there were pages of financial records, business transactions, and names he didn't recognize. But what caught his attention was a single sheet of paper at the very top. It was a letter, and the date on it was just a few weeks before his mother's death. The letter was addressed to Brian Parker from an unnamed individual, someone clearly involved in Brian's illegal dealings. The contents were cryptic but unmistakable. It was clear that his father had been involved in far more than just financial crimes. The letter mentioned a plan to silence someone who knew too much, someone who was threatening to expose their operations. And at the bottom, the name that chilled Ethan to his core was written in a scrawl: Linda Parker, his mother. His blood ran cold as the realization hit him like a tidal wave. Brian hadn't just been hiding money or laundering funds. He had been involved in a scheme to cover up his wife's death. She had known too much, and she had been silenced for it. Suddenly, a noise from downstairs broke Ethan from his thoughts. His heart leaped into his throat as he heard footsteps approaching the study. Panic surged through him. He couldn't get caught. He couldn't let Brian know he had been here. Without thinking, Ethan shoved the folder back into the drawer and quickly made his way to the window. He had no time to waste. He grabbed the rope that Lila had left for him and tied it to the sturdy frame of the desk. His hands shook as he began to climb out of the window, careful not to make any noise. The drop wasn't far, but his stomach churned with the fear of being caught. He landed softly on the ground and sprinted toward the garage, his heart pounding. Lila was waiting for him, her face tense as she watched for any signs of movement inside the house. "You found it?" she whispered urgently. Ethan nodded, holding up the folder. "I found everything. It's worse than I thought, Lila. My mom, she wasn't just killed. She was murdered because she knew too much." Lila's face hardened, a look of determination crossing her features. "We have to move quickly now. We need to get this to the right people before your father can destroy it." Ethan's stomach twisted as they made their way toward the car. There was no turning back now. The truth was out, and he would stop at nothing to expose the man who had torn his family apart. The drive to the safe house was filled with an eerie silence. Ethan sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the night passed by in a blur. His mind was racing, thoughts spinning in every direction. He had uncovered the truth. His mother had been murdered, and his father was behind it all. The realization gnawed at him, making him feel like a stranger in his own life. Everything he had believed about his father, about his family, had been shattered in the span of a few days. Lila was driving, her face hard with determination, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of concern. She had been through this before, dealing with the lies, the danger, the secrecy. But this was different. This wasn't just about protecting herself anymore. It was about protecting Ethan, about making sure that the truth finally came to light. "I can't believe this is happening," Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. "I still don't understand why my dad would do this. I thought he loved Mom. I thought he loved me." Lila glanced at him briefly before focusing back on the road. "It's not about love, Ethan. It's about power. Your father built an empire, and when your mom threatened to tear it down, he had no choice but to silence her." Ethan shook his head, feeling a deep anger rise within him. He didn't have to kill her. There were other ways to handle it. Why did he have to go so far? "Because," Lila said quietly, "your father isn't the man you think he is. He's been living a double life for years, and when the truth came too close to the surface, he did what he's always done. He protected himself." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the stomach. His father wasn't the man he had always admired. He wasn't the hero of Oakwood. He was a liar, a manipulator, and a killer. Ethan didn't know what to feel anymore. Anger, betrayal, sorrow, it was all mixed together. A heavy weight he couldn't escape. The car sped down the dark road, the headlights illuminating the path ahead. Ethan's grip tightened on the folder in his lap, the evidence of his father's crimes, the proof that could bring everything crashing down. He had to get it to the right people. They had to know the truth. As they drove deeper into the woods, the road grew darker, the trees closing in on both sides. Lila's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and her eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor immediately. "Do you think he knows we took it?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Lila didn't answer right away. She just kept her eyes on the road, her expression unreadable. "He's probably figured it out by now," she said finally. "He's not stupid, Ethan. If he hasn't already sent people after us, he will soon." Ethan's stomach twisted. He had known this would come, but hearing it out loud made it feel so real. The people his father had surrounded himself with weren't just business partners. They were criminals, willing to do anything to protect their interests. Ethan had no doubt that if Brian sent them after him, they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to stop him from exposing the truth. They reached the safe house shortly after, a small cabin tucked deep in the woods. It was isolated, the perfect place to hide out until they could figure out what to do next. Lila pulled the car into the gravel driveway, and they quickly made their way inside. Ethan barely registered the details of the cabin. It was small, rustic, but it was safe, at least for now. Lila led him through the front door and into a small living room. There was a fireplace in the corner, a few old chairs, and a table cluttered with papers. It looked like a place for someone to hide, but not for long. "I'll call Claire," Lila said, already pulling out her phone. "We need to get the files to her as soon as possible. She's the one who can get this to the right people, expose everything for what it is." Ethan nodded, pacing the room. He couldn't sit still. His mind was racing again, thinking of the consequences, the people who might come after them. He wanted to make sure his father paid for what he had done. But what if it cost him everything? What if exposing the truth meant losing his family forever? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he froze. Lila looked up sharply, her expression tense. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "I'll check." Ethan barely had time to react before Lila moved to the door, her hand on the knob. She peered through the small window in the door, her face going pale. Ethan's heart was in his throat. Who could it be? Brian's men? Or worse, Victor Kane? Lila's voice came back to him, barely a whisper. "It's not them," she said, her voice a little more relieved but still cautious. "But we can't be too careful. The door creaked open, revealing a familiar face. Claire Hughes, the journalist who had agreed to help them, stood on the doorstep. She looked a little worse for wear, her eyes tired, her hair disheveled, but she was there. Ethan felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he saw her. She was the key to making sure the truth was exposed. "We have it," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with anticipation. "We have everything." Claire stepped inside, her eyes flicking from Ethan to the folder he was holding. "Good," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "Let's not waste any time." They sat down at the small table in the cabin, and Ethan handed Claire the folder. She immediately began flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the documents with practiced precision. As she read, the silence in the room became more palpable, the tension rising with each passing moment. "This is huge," Claire said finally, looking up at them. "This is the kind of story that could take down an entire network. If we release this, there's no going back. You both know that." Ethan nodded. "We know, but it's time. My mom deserves justice, and I can't let my father get away with what he did." Lila stepped forward, her voice hard. "We don't have time to waste. We need to get this out there now. Your father's not going to stop until he's silenced us. If we don't act quickly, we might never get the chance." Claire nodded, pulling out her laptop. "I'll get to work on this right away. I know exactly who to send it to. But you need to be prepared. Once this hits, there's going to be fallout. People won't just sit back and let you expose them. You'll be targets." Ethan's heart raced as Claire started typing, uploading the files, sending them to the right contacts. He couldn't stop thinking about his father's wrath, about the people who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. But at that moment, Ethan knew that there was no turning back. The truth was out there, and nothing could stop it now. The days that followed were a whirlwind of uncertainty and tension. The documents that Ethan had uncovered, the irrefutable proof of his father's criminal activities, had been sent to trusted journalists and officials. Claire had worked around the clock, carefully preparing everything to be published, ensuring the story would break in the most powerful outlets. The plan was simple. Release the story, let the truth come to light, and expose Brian Parker for who he really was. But in the midst of the storm, Ethan couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. What had they unleashed? They had already made themselves targets, and now that the story was set to go public, there was no telling what lengths Brian would go to protect his secrets. It was late in the evening when Ethan's phone buzzed with a notification. He'd been pacing the cabin, unable to sit still, his mind racing with thoughts of his father. He hesitated before picking it up, his heart pounding as he saw the headline. "Breaking. Prominent Oakwood businessman Brian Parker, linked to murder and massive financial fraud." The headline alone was enough to make Ethan's stomach churn. It was happening. The truth was out. His father, the man he had once admired, was now being exposed for the world to see. The article outlined the connections to Victor Kane, the fraudulent charities, the offshore accounts, and, most damning of all, the role Brian had played in his wife's death. Ethan felt a sickening mix of satisfaction and dread. This was the moment he had fought for, the moment he had risked everything to bring to light. But now that it was here, he wasn't sure how he felt. Lila stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the phone screen. "It's out," she said, her voice low and tense. "It's out there, Ethan. Now we wait." Ethan couldn't bring himself to respond. He kept staring at the article, the words swimming in his mind. Was this what he wanted? Was this what he had hoped for all along? The moment of truth had arrived, but it came with consequences he hadn't fully understood. His father was a powerful man, a man who had spent his entire life building an empire. How far would he go to protect it? A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Layla immediately tensed, her body language shifting into alert mode. "Stay back," she whispered, stepping cautiously toward the door. Ethan held his breath, his heart racing. Was it Brian? Were his men here to silence them? Lila peered through the window, then exhaled in relief. "It's Claire," she said, opening the door to reveal the journalist, who had clearly been on edge. "We need to move," Claire said without preamble. "The fallout's already starting. I've received calls from all over the place. Your father's people are scrambling, trying to control the damage, and some of them are getting desperate." Ethan's chest tightened. "What's happening? Is he coming for us?" Claire nodded grimly. "They're already on the move. Your father's been making calls, trying to shut this down. He's threatening legal action. But I know he'll do whatever it takes to bury this. We have to assume they know you're involved. They'll be coming for you next." Lila stepped forward, her expression hardening. "We can't stay here then. We need to go, now." The room filled with urgency. Ethan felt his entire world spin. He had spent months, maybe even years, trying to uncover the truth. And now, as the consequences unfolded before him, he was terrified of what would come next. His father's empire was crumbling, and everyone involved had something to lose. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Where do we go? What's our next move?" Claire looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "We need to lay low for a while. I'll help get you out of here, but you can't stay in Oakwood. It's too dangerous. Your father has too many connections here. We'll figure out a safer place once we're out of town." Lila grabbed her jacket from the back of a chair, moving quickly as she spoke. "We need to make sure we're not followed. If they know where we are, they'll track us down. We need to cover our tracks." Ethan barely had time to think before Claire was pulling him toward the door. He grabbed the folder with the documents and stuffed it into his bag, his hands trembling. He couldn't believe it was happening. He had spent his entire life believing his father was a good man. But now that the truth had come to light, there was no turning back. His father was a criminal, and Ethan had exposed him. He was marked, and there was no telling how far Brian Parker would go to protect his empire. Lila and Claire led Ethan down a winding path through the woods behind the cabin, moving swiftly but cautiously. Ethan's mind was in a blur. He could still hear the reporter's voice in his head, reading off the details of the article. His father's name had been smeared across every major news outlet in the country. But Brian had power. Ethan knew that. He was a businessman, a manipulator, and he had people on his side. People willing to do whatever it took to silence the truth. The air was cool, the trees casting long shadows as they made their way to Claire's car. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his thoughts racing. He had spent his entire life in a small town, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business. But now, Oakwood felt like a cage. His whole life, everything he had known, had been built on a lie. When they reached the car, Claire quickly unlocked it and ushered them inside. Ethan sat in the back, staring out the window as the car started and pulled away from the cabin. The landscape blurred as they drove away from Oakwood, leaving behind the place that had once felt like home. But Ethan knew there was no going back. Not now. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, breaking the silence that had settled in the car. He turned to Claire, his voice quiet but firm. "Somewhere safe," Claire replied. "But first, we need to check in with my contacts. We need to make sure the story sticks, that the evidence doesn't disappear. Once the media has it, there's no stopping it." Ethan nodded, feeling a sense of helplessness settle over him. The story was out. But was it enough to take down his father? Would Brian fight back with everything he had? Ethan's mind swirled with questions, but he knew there was only one thing left to do: stay ahead of his father's reach and make sure the truth was heard. But the road ahead was uncertain. They had exposed the lies, but now they had to survive the fallout. And Ethan wasn't sure what was more terrifying: the storm that had already begun, or the storm that was coming for them. The days that followed were a blur of travel and hiding. Ethan, Lila, and Claire had made their way out of Oakwood, driving through back roads and avoiding major highways. The world outside the car seemed distant, unreal. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about everything he had uncovered: the truth about his father, his mother's death, and the life he thought he knew, which had all turned out to be a lie. The weight of the past few days pressed heavily on him, but the truth had to come out. There was no turning back now. As they drove, Claire made contact with several of her journalist friends who had connections to higher-up authorities. They worked in secret, gathering all the evidence they could, making sure that the story would be solid enough to withstand any attempt to suppress it. But Ethan knew, deep down, that they were only scratching the surface. His father's empire wasn't just made up of illegal business dealings. It was built on manipulation, coercion, and threats. Brian had too many connections, too many people in powerful places, to let his empire fall easily. Even as they drove, Ethan could feel the shadow of danger following them. It wasn't just his father's fury that they had to fear. It was the unseen enemies, the ones who had been working in the shadows all along, keeping the secret. Now, those people would be desperate to cover their tracks, desperate enough to silence anyone who stood in their way. They had managed to reach a small town a few hundred miles away, a place where no one knew their names. It was a quiet little place, tucked away from the world's prying eyes. Claire had arranged for them to stay at a small guest house on the outskirts of town, where they could regroup and plan their next move. But the fear still lingered in Ethan's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. As they settled into their new temporary home, Ethan couldn't rest. Every creak of the floorboards, every knock on the door, sent a jolt of panic through him. He couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not when the truth was out there and his father was still out there, with his web of influence and power. "How long do we stay here?" Ethan asked, his voice low, his gaze scanning the small room. It was sparsely furnished. Nothing fancy, just a bed, a small desk, and a few chairs. It felt like a temporary solution to a permanent problem. "For as long as we need to," Claire replied, sitting at the table with her laptop open. "But we can't afford to stay here too long. Your father's people are going to be looking for you, and it's only a matter of time before they catch up with us." Ethan nodded, feeling a weight settle on his chest. The walls felt like they were closing in on him. It had only been a few days since the story broke, but already the pressure was building. Ethan had been contacted by several news outlets who wanted his side of the story, but every time he thought about speaking out, something in his gut told him it wasn't the right time. He had exposed his father for the monster he was, but the fight wasn't over. It had just begun. Lila stood up, her eyes focused, scanning the room with a vigilance that made Ethan uneasy. "We need to make sure we're not being followed. If they're tracking us, we'll be in even more danger." Ethan could see the worry in Lila's eyes. She had seen this kind of danger before, but it was different now. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him, and that made everything worse. He wasn't just a bystander in this fight. He was the target. "How do we know if we're being followed?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with concern. Lila walked over to the window and peered out, her face tense. "We'll need to check for surveillance, make sure the car isn't being tracked, and that we're not being tailed by anyone who might be connected to your father's network. Brian's people have eyes everywhere." Ethan swallowed, feeling his stomach churn. It seemed like everything had spiraled out of control so quickly. Just days ago, he was a high school student trying to figure out his future. Now, he was on the run, hiding from the very people he had once trusted. "What do we do now?" Ethan asked. "We can't keep running forever." "We won't have to," Claire said, looking up from her laptop. "I've contacted some people who are ready to help. We just need to get the evidence into the right hands. I'm working with a few government contacts who can make sure this doesn't get buried." Ethan nodded, but doubt lingered in his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deeply entrenched his father's corruption was. Even if they managed to expose him, how would they ensure that it would stick? Brian had too many connections, too many people in power. It was like trying to take down a giant, one piece at a time, while it loomed over them. Later that night, after dinner, they gathered around the small table in the guest house. Lila had managed to track down some of Brian's more questionable associates, people who had ties to illegal activities. But none of them were willing to talk. Fear had kept them quiet, and the web of corruption seemed unbreakable. Every lead they chased turned cold. Every person they tried to reach out to was either too scared or too loyal to Brian to help. Ethan slammed his fist on the table in frustration. "We're running out of time," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "We have the evidence. We know what he did. Why isn't anything happening? Why are people still protecting him?" Lila met his gaze, her face hard. "Because that's how this works, Ethan. People with power don't get taken down easily. And your father has spent years building an empire. There are people who will do anything to protect him, no matter what he's done." Ethan felt the weight of her words sink in. His father wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a corrupt man trying to cover up his crimes. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. And as long as people like Brian Parker were in power, the truth would always be buried beneath layers of lies, corruption, and fear. But Ethan wasn't going to let that happen. He couldn't. His mother's death, his father's betrayal, it had to matter. People had to know the truth. And if it meant fighting back against a system that was stacked against him, then that's exactly what he would do. "I'm not stopping," Ethan said, his voice fierce. "I don't care who they send after me. I'm not going to let them silence me. I'm going to make sure the world knows what my father did." Lila's eyes softened as she looked at him. "You're not alone in this. We're in this together. But we have to be smart. We can't just rush in blindly. We need a plan." Claire nodded. "We're not out of options yet. I have some people who can help. But we need to stay ahead of the game. The story's already out. But now we have to make sure we finish what we started." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind focused. "Then let's finish it." Ethan had never felt so determined in his life. The truth was finally out, and nothing was going to stop him from making sure that it stayed in the light. His mother's death, his father's betrayal, the web of lies and corruption, it had all come to this moment. The fight for justice was no longer something distant or abstract. It was personal. It was his fight. Lila, Claire, and Ethan had spent the last few days hiding, strategizing, and gathering any last pieces of information they could. They knew they couldn't remain in the small town for much longer. Word of the story had spread, and Ethan's father, Brian Parker, was not one to take such an assault on his reputation lying down. His empire was crumbling, and he would stop at nothing to protect what he had built. The quiet town they were hiding in felt like a temporary refuge, but they couldn't risk staying there too long. Even the small remote cabin they had been using as their base of operations felt like a trap waiting to spring. Brian's people would be looking for them, Ethan was sure of it, and he was terrified of what would happen when they found them. They had a plan, though. Claire had connected with several of her contacts in the media world, and with their help, she had been able to get Ethan's story into the hands of people who could push it to the next level. The public had a right to know what Brian had done, what kind of man he truly was. But the battle was far from over. The stakes had never been higher, and they knew the consequences of failure. "We can't afford to get careless now," Claire said one evening as they gathered in the cabin. "The information we have is explosive, but it's also dangerous. If Brian's men are tracking us, we need to get ahead of them. We can't let them intercept this before it's too late." Lila paced back and forth in the small living room. "We need to get the documents to the authorities. Once the right people have them, they'll be forced to act. But we can't trust just anyone. Brian has connections everywhere." Ethan nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His mind kept returning to the moment he had stood in that courtroom, ready to expose his father. Now, with everything that had happened, he couldn't help but wonder what it would mean for his future. What would happen to him once the truth came out? Would he ever be able to return to a normal life? "I'll take it to them," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'll make sure it's delivered to the right people. I'm done hiding. I want this to end." Lila and Claire exchanged a glance. "You're sure?" Lila asked, concern in her eyes. "This is dangerous. You're going up against a man who has nothing to lose." "I'm sure," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "It's the only way this will end. My father has taken everything from me. My mother's death, his lies. It's time for him to pay." Claire took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, but we'll do this carefully. You're not going alone. We'll be with you every step of the way." The next morning, they made preparations. Ethan knew the risks, but he also knew there was no other way. Brian's influence extended far beyond Oakwood, but Ethan had a chance to make sure it didn't stretch any farther. With the documents, they had a chance to destroy the empire Brian had built, but they had to act fast before Brian could regroup and silence them once and for all. They spent the morning organizing the evidence, copies of the documents, the emails, the financial records, and securing it in an unmarked envelope. Claire had already arranged for a trusted contact in the government to meet them, a person who could ensure that everything was handled by the right authorities. Ethan's heart raced as he thought about what was coming. He didn't know what would happen when the truth finally hit, but he knew it would be the end of everything. He couldn't back out now. At dusk, they left the cabin, taking the winding roads that led out of town. They knew that getting out of sight quickly was their best chance. Brian's men would be out there looking for them, and the longer they waited, the more dangerous it would become. The car ride was tense, filled with unspoken thoughts. Ethan stared out the window, his thoughts consumed by the weight of the truth. Every moment felt like it was moving in slow motion. After what seemed like hours, they reached the drop-off point, a small, nondescript parking garage in a nearby city. Claire's contact, a journalist named Thomas, was already there, waiting in a dimly lit corner. He was a tall man with sharp features, his face hard from years of dealing with dangerous stories. When he saw them approach, he nodded, his expression unreadable. "You got it?" Thomas asked, his voice low. Ethan didn't hesitate. He handed him the envelope, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's all in there. The full story. The truth about my father. About everything." Thomas nodded again, quickly tucking the envelope into his jacket. "We'll get it into the right hands. Don't worry. This will be over soon." As he turned to leave, A car screeched to a halt outside the garage. Ethan's blood ran cold. He could hear the doors opening and closing, heavy footsteps echoing in the concrete space. Someone was coming. Someone who didn't want this truth to come out. "Go," Claire hissed, pulling Ethan toward the back exit. "We have to move now." They darted through the narrow hallways of the parking garage, moving quickly but quietly. Ethan's mind raced, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted. Every sound, every movement made his heart race faster. He kept looking over his shoulder, waiting for the inevitable confrontation. They reached the alley behind the garage when the first gunshot rang out. Ethan froze, his body instinctively ducking behind a metal dumpster. Lila and Claire followed his lead, taking cover as the sound of footsteps grew louder. Ethan's pulse was pounding in his ears as he realized just how close they were to being caught. They couldn't outrun them. Not now. The second gunshot followed quickly, and then a shout. "They're here!" Ethan didn't have time to think. He grabbed Lila's arm and pulled her behind a row of trash cans, his mind racing for an escape plan. The alley was narrow, and their options were limited. But they couldn't let Brian's people get to them. Not now. "We need to get out of here," Claire whispered urgently. "This isn't safe." Ethan nodded, already calculating the best route. He didn't know if they could outrun the men chasing them, but he couldn't let them take him or his friends. The documents had to make it into the right hands. It was their only chance. They bolted down the alley, their footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. Behind them, the men were getting closer, and Ethan's mind raced faster than his legs could carry him. There was no turning back. If they were caught now, everything would be over.